Welcome to our first season of the podcast, Grow from Darkness. We are your hosts, Amanda Blackwood.
And Hrisanthi Dokos from Coast to Coast. As some of our listeners know, we're both survivors of complex trauma, and it's our mission to help others experiencing similar issues.
This season, we're going to be digging into trauma reactions, their long term consequences, and how we fight back to live our best lives. This is the first episode, Hrisanthi, and I'm really excited that we're able to do this. I've been wanting to do this for a long time, but I met the perfect partner in you to be able to do this with. So I just wanted to get that out there first.
Oh, look, I feel exactly the same. I've been wanting to do something in this area for so long, and it's just amazing how life brings these opportunities that you just have no idea, you just cannot even predict would happen. And so it's such an incredible opportunity, and I just thank you from the bottom of my heart for being open to doing this with me.
Oh, absolutely. I wouldn't have missed this opportunity. I just made a best friend halfway across the world.
I know, isn't it amazing? Like, I'm in Australia, almost close to Antarctica, and you're on the other side of the world in the northern hemisphere is just, yeah, blows my mind.
Yeah, it's such a weird feeling, but also really cool. I mean, we're connected in so many ways. We don't have to be physically sitting in the same room.
No, that's absolutely right. And isn't that just the beauty of modern technology, that we can have these connections with people anywhere in the world? It's one of the beautiful things about modern technology.
Well, I heard rumor that you had people who were confused about what it was that we were going to do or how we were going to do it. But I hope when they hear this episode, they're going to start to realize that we don't have to be sitting down together to be friends or to be talking about or experiencing the same things.
Absolutely not. Yeah.
That's what the whole thing is about.
Absolutely, that's right. So thank you, those gurus who came up with this technology.
Yes, computer geniuses, because I sure couldn't do it. So this whole season, we said in the intro that we're going to be talking about trauma reactions and how we fight back against them to live our best lives. So what is a trauma reaction? This is something that I've heard literally hundreds, if not thousands of times. What is a trauma reaction? How do you classify a trauma reaction? And I've seen so many definitions. Hrisanthi, what would you define as a trauma reaction?
I see a trauma reaction as being an emotional response to something that has been an invasive experience in some way, whether that's been physically, so in an accident, a car accident, for example, or some kind of physical abuse or sexual assault. It could be the death of a friend or a partner or a family member. So there's an event that takes place and we have an emotional response to it that scars us in some way at that sort of really deep level within our being.
That's a really good way to put it. And I think one of the things that's really important to remember for a lot of people is that whatever the trauma is, wherever it comes from, it's not always a life-threatening event. It doesn't have to come with a death consequence. But even then, it's still pretty broad. So sometimes to be able to really understand what a trauma reaction is, it's really important to understand what trauma is. We both have lived through several different types of trauma. We've experienced things that hopefully not a lot of other people have, but yet, sadly, many people can identify with and probably do deal with trauma reactions from this. So what are some of the trauma and PTSD related things that you have personally experienced that you've been through?
Oh, wow. Well, I think before we go down that track, I really think it's important people understand the different types of trauma. Like there's 3 main types of trauma. Do you mind if we talk about that first?
Yes, let's do.
Yeah, so the first type is acute trauma. So that's just like something from a single incident, like um, somebody hit you, or you've had a car accident, or you've fallen down the side of a cliff, or something, something. It's just one incident that's occurred. Then there's chronic trauma. So that's the second type. And that is something that is repeated and it's prolonged and it lasts, a long time. It could be like domestic violence or abuse or human trafficking or, something like that. And then there's complex trauma, which is you've been exposed to a variety of different traumatic events, and it's a very invasive and interpersonal kind of experience that, as I said, it's from multiple areas. Does that make sense? No?
It does. It does. Yeah, and I think for me personally, up until I learned what complex trauma was, I would have categorized myself as having survived chronic trauma, you
Mm,
know, um, because it was repeated, prolonged abuse, like you said. But when I learned more about complex trauma being a variety of different types of traumas, I started to realize that that definitely more describes what it was that I'd been through. While I was a victim of human trafficking for a while, I was also a victim of domestic violence, both as an adult and as a child. I was sexually assaulted and raped as a teenager. Just all these different traumas just kind of all build up and start telling us terrible things about ourselves inside our brain. And it's definitely a complex trauma.
yeah. And I think you've really hit the nail on the head there, in terms of it does something to our brain. And that's one of the long-term consequences. We start believing things about ourselves that just aren't true. We feel we're not good enough. We feel um, shame. We feel guilt when we were the victims. And in fact, the perpetrator should be the one that feels shame or guilt or whatever. But we end up believing that we're a bad person or that we're not good enough. And it destroys our sense of self. And I actually think that's probably the most insidious aspect of complex trauma and the long-term consequence, because that sort of sets us up in our minds. It gives us almost like a blueprint of who we are as a human being and how we relate to other people. And that sets us up for more trauma, to be honest.
Right. Yeah, I agree. Yeah, and I in this series, I have personally compiled a list of over 50 different trauma responses. Um, and we're going to be going into a lot of these throughout the podcast. But there's so many different things that our bodies do after being traumatized as a result of the trauma. There's different categories each for each of the different trauma reactions too. There's physical reactions, mental, autonomical, emotional. I mean, a lot of people don't realize that the autonomical responses of our bodies, such as the beating of our heart, can be altered by trauma, even when the trauma is no longer happening. I used to have these heart palpitations. Oh my gosh,
Mm,
not even funny.
mm,
Just driving down the road, absolutely nothing triggers a trauma response from me. And then there it is. I feel like I'm having a heart attack at 30 years old.
mhm. Mhm. I can relate to that. I actually, a few years back now, I had invasive investigations into my heart to find out what was wrong with it,
Wow.
because
Yeah.
I was, I it was just awful. And they kept saying, "Look, but we can't find exactly what's wrong, but your ECG's not right. We're going to have to take you interstate and get more tests done." And in the end, I just said, "No, enough." I was actually finding the investigative medical stuff traumatizing in itself.
Right.
You know? So yeah,
Them
I've been
telling
there
you
with the
there's
heart
something wrong, but we don't
palpitations.
know what. Yeah. Ugh.
And it goes back to something we were saying offline before about the medical system and when post-traumatic stress disorder was first accepted as a medical term. I can't believe how recently that term was accepted. So can you just run us again through that?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
I
You
said
cut out a little bit.
the PTSD
Mm.
was not accepted as a medical condition or term until fairly recently. You said you were doing some research into that.
Yes. Um, so for a long time, what we now refer to as PTSD was called shell shock. This was a term that was originally used by the name by the man, but then blah, blah, blah. This was originally used and coined by a gentleman by the name of Charles Myers in 1915 during World War One,
Mm,
because he was looking for a way to describe the soldiers who were experiencing what he called unusual symptoms.
mhm.
Shell shock typically is not something that's used in psychiatric treatment or descriptions today, but people still use it, and it's been over 100 years. So the term PTSD was finally added to the American Psychiatric Association um, in 1980. So it took that many years, way too many years, for them to be able to figure out what post traumatic stress disorder was and to be able to give it a vehicle to be able to start helping to diagnose people. But trauma wasn't actually included in the description of PTSD until 2013.
Which is just crazy. I mean, how does that work? I just don't understand that at all. It does not make
Yeah.
sense to me. Because I think I said something along the lines of it's taken a long time for the medical world to actually catch up with lived experience and have an understanding of lived experience
Right.
and connect the dots.
Right. I agree. And the word trauma can mean so many different things. You know, you mentioned a few things earlier that it can be related to an event or an experience. But a lot of people use it interchangeably these days to reference that event, but also what happens to us afterwards, the traumatic responses that our bodies have. That is also now considered trauma. It's an
Exactly.
ongoing trauma.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
so when they added trauma into the psychiatric development in PTSD, it was expanded. They actually started to include people who had witnessed in-person traumatic events that happened to
Mm,
other people, like
exactly.
witnessing a violent or accident or something that ended somebody's life or put somebody else's life at risk.
Exactly.
Um, and
Amanda, do
while
you
it's
mind
still,
if we just pause there for one moment? I'm sorry,
sure,
there is a bit of an interruption happening down here.
no, you're good. Sounds like the ice cream man showed up.
I wouldn't have minded the ice cream van coming past, actually.
Well, yeah, it's summertime there. I mean, I'm sitting out here with a foot of snow in my front yard.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah,
See, we
yeah.
just don't even get that at all here, but now we're digressing. So,
Ah, so, um, let's say, oh, I don't even know what I was talking about. Something about trauma. Anyway, uh, oh yeah, so when they started to include things that people witnessed as being traumatic events and stuff,
mm,
that was in 2013. It
mm,
was in 2015 when they made the medical connection between autoimmune diseases like Crohn's disease
mm,
and severe emotional trauma.
mm,
And it was also coincidentally in 2015 when I was diagnosed with Crohn's disease, and nobody knew why. Nobody
mm,
could tell me how Crohn's disease existed or if it was hereditary or not.
mm.
And there's so much that goes into that possibly being hereditary. That was one of their things for so many years. But how many times have we talked about generational traumas?
Exactly, which it's really interesting that you say it was 2015 because in 2014, I was diagnosed with an autoimmune disorder called psoriatic arthritis. And my rheumatologist, was asking me about my lived experience, and I, gave her several examples of, traumatic events in my life. And she just looked at me and she said, well, that will do it.
Yeah.
And I was just shocked, because at that point in time, I didn't know that these really severe physical ailments were related to an emotional experience. And the more that I've researched into this area, the more it's just made so much sense, the sorts of things that my body has gone through. And I've really come to understand the mind, body, and I'd say soul or spirit connection.
Yes. Yeah.
We're one integrated being. We're not, our bodies can't be separated from our minds, our emotions, our perceptions and views of the world. It's all so interrelated.
Right. And when we start trying to separate those things, as when we start going to some of these other trauma reactions, like, and we'll talk about this in another episode, but dissociative identity disorder used to be called schizophrenia, or multiple personality disorder. Sorry, not schizophrenia. So that's one of the things that happens when we begin to disassociate from our bodies. We start to feel ourselves kind of slipping away from the rest of everything that we are. Our brain, our spirit, our soul is starting to become disconnected because of the traumas and because we can't reconcile everything that's happened.
Yeah, exactly. And I've been through that. There have been some pretty dark periods in my life where I've certainly felt that, completely disconnected from other people, from my life, disconnected from this world. Didn't really want to be here, but the only way that I could manage was through substance abuse.
Yeah. A lot of people can identify with that. I had a problem with alcohol when I
Mm-hmm.
was in the middle of being trafficked.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I remember one period in my life where the only thing that could keep me going is 2 bottles of wine every night.
Wow.
Mhm, mhm.
And that's a form of self-medication. That is another trauma reaction.
Complete
I mean,
self-medication.
this is all stuff that we're going to be covering in the weeks to come, and holy cow, there's a lot.
It is, and it's just from a purely objective perspective, for me, it's been a really interesting journey researching into this area. And one of the people that have really influenced my understanding is a guy called Gabor Mate. Have you come across him at all?
I know that name. I think I have seen that name in some of my research.
Yeah, he's really interesting. He's a Canadian physician. He's originally from Hungary, and after World War II, he and his family migrated to Canada. And he's obviously, World War II. I think he's of Jewish descent, so you know
Mm.
all of that's surrounding intergenerational trauma there. And after several years of working as a physician, he came to realize that there were some common elements with the kind of issues that his patients were coming to him with, and their lived experience, and traced it back to trauma.
Wow. It's fascinating that you just mentioned World War II. You just sparked a memory that came up for me from some of my research. Um, so it's not quite the same as generational trauma, but have you heard of historical trauma?
I have, but I don't really have a sound understanding of it. So yeah, please tell me more about it.
Okay. Well, the idea of historical trauma wasn't formed until after World War II, but it was used to describe this unusual form of residual impact on the Holocaust survivors' children. So it was described in 2015, again, 2015. There's been so many movements in the last
Mm.
15, in 10, 15 years. But it was described as a cumulative emotional, psychological wounding as a result of group traumatic experiences, which is transmitted across generations within a community. So basically, in a community of trauma survivors, like a community of Holocaust survivors, the constant reference to or avoidance of talking about the trauma is felt by others, kind of like tension in a room that's so thick you can cut it with a knife. It becomes this like permeating presence, and it sticks to all of the people around, kind of like cigarette smoke in a Las Vegas casino. It's just, you can't get rid of it. You can't just wash it off at the end of the day. It's stuck, just like cigarette smoke, secondhand smoke does permanent damage to your lungs.
Mm,
This avoidance of or constant reference to serious trauma in the background of somebody else's life can actually pass down this sense of a historical trauma to the next generation.
mm, mm. Look,
It's
it's
crazy.
interesting. It actually reminds me of my own lived experience with my family. My parents are both from Albania, which is a very small country north of Greece in Europe. And that is a country that has experienced so many invasions over the centuries. And there's been, it's been quite a traumatic past, in terms of the experiences there. And as a child, I remember my parents talking about living in Albania and the kinds of quite ugly experiences that they had, and that that's really embedded in my brain,
Yeah.
and I've taken that on. Like, I felt a real empathy towards my ancestors, and not just my ancestors, but the whole of Albanian population. And if I come across somebody who's Albanian, which is very rare, there's not many of us, I always feel an automatic empathy towards them because I know of the lived experience of that nation.
Right. Right. But I mean, you also take on that generation as a form of your identity.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, yeah.
That's
Yes,
where you came from.
totally, totally. It was a brutal society, really brutal. And there were, I can't think, tribal warfare, because the Ottomans, the Turks, overthrew Albania about 400 or 500 years ago, and the villages, there were Muslim villages, there were Christian villages, and that there was this sort of constant fighting and murdering between them.
Oof.
It was just horrific. And this was happening right up until when my mother was still was born. She was born in 1925, and she remembers incidents like that occurring in her lifetime, honor killings and things like that. And I can feel it in my stomach now. It's really weird, my stomach is churning thinking about this, because that's part of my DNA.
Yes. Yeah. That is exactly what historical trauma is. Not even necessarily generational trauma, but it can touch on generational trauma. But historical trauma, you're taking on the trauma of that entire nation
Mhm.
in your gut.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah.
And that is no easy thing.
It isn't. It isn't. In 1946, that country was overthrown by communists, and the resultant effect on the people is just, it's so hard to even understand, let alone to describe. My grandfather, for example, on my dad's side, he ended up in a jail, which I visited about 15 years ago. It was cold, it was dark, it was dank, and he didn't even have a bed.
Oh,
He was lying on a stone floor for 3 years of his life. because
Oh
he
my
was
gosh.
accused by a neighbour of doing something or other because of, just stupid stuff. But because of communism, there was a mistrust, and people were constantly, I can't think of a better term than dobbing on each other, like telling the
Right.
authorities that, so-and-so did this. And
Sounds like a witch hunt.
yeah, that's exactly what it was. It was a witch hunt, total witch hunt. And one of my aunts was killed in an honour killing, like she was
Ooh,
raped. And then her brother actually murdered her because
because
she,
she was a victim of rape.
correct, correct.
Wow.
So, I carry all of that. And, and that's not just that generation, but it's like previous generations. This is the culture that I was born into.
Right. Right.
So I really do have an affinity with what you're describing there. Yeah.
I think a little bit of experience with that as a kid growing up, but not much. So my dad grew up in upstate New York,
Mhm.
and from what I can understand of his childhood, he was a middle child. He had an older sister and a younger sister, and I've heard different versions of his life for many years.
Mm.
So I heard that his mother left them and then came back for the kids when she got remarried to somebody else, and then took the kids over to her new husband's home and left them there while she ran off with somebody else to another state. But I've also heard varying stories from other people. One was my uncle, who was the brother of my dad's father,
Mhm.
who said that that grandmother was actually quite a remarkable person, and she never would have done such a thing. She was trying to escape an extremely abusive relationship from my dad's stepdad, but she didn't take her kids there and dump them off. She felt that they would be safer with their real father, so she left them there, and then they took that as a sense of abandonment. So there's
Mm.
so many different things with my dad's life that I don't know really anything about.
Mm, mm.
And my mother, again, a middle child, grew up with one older brother, or one younger brother. Um, she talked about a lot of the stories about her childhood. Um, Most of them had undertones of abuse that I don't think she recognized.
Mhm.
And whenever something would happen to me where I would cry or get upset, she would usually combat that by saying something like, "Oh, you think this is abuse? You should have been there when I was growing up. This is nothing compared to what I've been through."
Wow.
And hearing that repeatedly, I think, is a sense of historical trauma, because if you remember, it was described as the reference to or avoidance of talking about the trauma.
Yeah. Yeah.
So they both had these somewhat traumatic childhoods, but they didn't talk about them at all. And
Mm.
all it did was build up that tension and cause us to fear what it was that they had lived through, and to feel this great distance between us and their families. I
Mm.
didn't know my grandparents really at any point when I was a kid growing up. There were people that we would see every 5 years.
Mhm.
It's
Mhm.
I think we both hit on both of those, either the constant reference to or the avoidance of
Mm.
talking about the historical trauma.
Yeah. Yeah. Interestingly, in my family, my father would talk a lot about it. My mother never spoke of it.
Wow. Wow. Which one do you think had a bigger impact on you?
That's a really good question. I think I've had lots of with my mother, because I didn't know, it was hard to understand her interactions with me, um, as a child. Like, she was very emotionally distant. Um, Whereas with my dad, it was like I was experiencing things vicariously through him with his stories.
Right.
So I think they both had a huge impact, but in different ways.
Well, and you just touched on another form of trauma. Have you heard of secondary trauma?
Yes.
Okay. Which
Yes.
you are way far advanced. Most people are not familiar with this term. They have no idea what secondary trauma is.
Mm.
Um, since you're familiar with it, can you give us kind of a rundown of what it sounds like, what it means?
Well, I think it's that example that I just used about my dad, in terms of him telling me stories of his childhood and his father and the abuse that he experienced from his father. My grandfather was an alcoholic and very violent. And my dad would often tell us stories of how he was growing up and things going on for him, and very explicit about the abuse that he experienced. Um, and then, that would come on to me. I would feel his pain. So that's my understanding of secondary trauma.
When you were a kid, I mean, one of the greatest tools that a child has is the imagination. Did you find yourself starting to visualize the events that he was describing?
Oh, yes, very
Yeah.
much so. And I also used to have repeated nightmares.
Oh, yeah. So those thoughts, those mental images that he was giving you eventually begin to start tricking your brain into thinking that you were actually a witness to it or you
Mm,
actually experienced it yourself, which is where those nightmares come from.
exactly, exactly.
So, and from what I understand, this is very common among therapists and the go-to person in a friends group who hears what everybody else is complaining about. It's
Mm.
called a compassion fatigue.
Mm, mm.
Yeah, it's some pretty serious stuff.
It
I have
is.
a disclaimer on my messenger on my public Facebook account that if people want to talk to me about their traumas, they say there's a question button they can hit. Can I talk to you about my traumatic past?
Mm,
And the automatic response explains that this is not something that's wise to do. If you give a visual, a mental image to somebody of the abuse that you have yourself experienced, you can cause more damage than you can possibly imagine. And the
mm.
best thing to do is to reach out to a therapist or a mental health professional if you need to talk about explicit details.
Definitely, definitely. It's not something that you can share with a friend over a cup of coffee.
Right. I mean, talking to somebody like you about, hey, this is what's going on this week and it's been a hard week, that can be okay on a certain level, but when you start getting into details, that's
Mm.
damaging.
It really is. It very
Yeah.
much is. Yeah. So maybe this is a good point in our conversation to perhaps think about, well, how do we fight back around after having experienced trauma? What kind of
Absolutely.
trauma responses?
So
So
I've been doing a lot of research on this, but I know everybody has their own different way. What have you found that helps you or has helped you the best?
for me, I think the most critical thing is the acceptance that what I experienced wasn't just life. Not everybody experienced complex trauma in the way that I had, although there are millions of people around the world that have. It's not necessarily a commonplace thing.
Right.
And so I think that acceptance that I have experienced and that I needed help, that I had to reach out for that extra support from a therapist to help me, unpack things and understand how it's impacted on me. And for example, like I said earlier in this podcast, how my rheumatologist said to me, "Oh yes, well, all that trauma that you've experienced will lead to your autoimmune disorder." That to me was a wake up call.
Yes. Yep.
So then
It's
it's about
huge.
managing my life in a way that puts me in a safe place, but not hiding, not avoiding, um, which is a topic that we're going to go into more depth. It's about, for me, creating boundaries and being safe within myself, which is not something that I felt for decades.
Right.
No. And I think if we can find that safe place within ourselves to self-care, look after ourselves, love ourselves, honour ourselves, if we can start doing that, we're on the path to healing.
Right. I think that's fabulous. I think there are so many people who could really benefit from following in your footsteps and starting to accept and understand that what they've been through is not only not a normal life, but also not their fault.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. I used
For
to
me,
always think, what is it? Why me? What is it about me that keeps causing these things to happen? So I think I think that's a very important point that you've raised, and I couldn't emphasize it enough. It's not us. We're not
right,
doing it to ourselves.
right, exactly. And it might even feel like we are absolute magnets for
Mm,
it. But and that's something that we'll dig into later on too. There's a trauma response that is
mm,
absolutely connected to that. And I definitely want to explore that in depth in a future episode. But that's a very real issue for a lot of trauma survivors. It's
mm,
it's my fault because I keep attracting them,
mm, mm, mm.
and that's also the subject of a future book that I'm writing about healthy boundaries.
Wonderful. I look
So
forward to reading that.
yes. The things that helped me when I was dealing with everything that I've been through is, like I said, I didn't deal with it for a very long time.
Mm,
The man who trafficked me came out of the woodwork with attacks against me in 2019 that left me absolutely staggering. I couldn't breathe. All of my old trauma responses were coming back, the heart palpitations, the looking over my shoulder, the paranoia, the all of this stuff came flooding back. I was an emotional wreck. At the same time, I was trying to suppress my feelings. So I mean, there were
mm,
things just playing off of each other.
mhm,
And so I started seeing a therapist. I
mhm.
needed somebody's help. And in the therapy sessions, I was not a huge fan of my first therapist, and I ended up getting a second therapist, which is perfectly okay to do because they're not going to take it personally. You have to find somebody that you're comfortable talking to.
I'm up to number
Um,
6.
yeah, yeah, that's quite a bit more normal. I was super lucky that I found my therapist, the second one that I went to. She was amazing. She specifically worked with an anti-trafficking group that I was a member of
Wow.
at the time.
You were very, very fortunate to find her.
Yes, yeah, she was incredible. Shout out to Amy, she's amazing. Um, but when she and I were talking in our biweekly sessions, eventually I started to kind of open up and realize that I was in a safe place to be able to start exploring what it was that I was
Mm,
feeling and finding what it was connected to.
mm,
And then I spiraled on my own and I started digging up this world of research. And it wasn't even just the technical side of being able to figure out when something was classified as PTSD and how the name shell shock came to be in 1915. It was things like what happened to me when I was 4 that causes me to respond this way to this particular event now.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
That research and learning about me and learning about my roots and learning about this huge list of more than 50 trauma responses, that was the biggest help for me. That was where I grew from the darkness. That
Mm,
was where I started to rise up and figure out, hey, this isn't a normal life. And I am not a magnet for this. I just have unhealthy boundaries and I am allowing this to happen to me.
mhm,
And I need to stop doing that.
mm, mm. Yeah, we've had very similar journeys, Amanda. It's quite incredible, really, at different stages of our lives. And um, yeah, I think that's one of the reasons, excuse me, that we've connected, because even though our traumatic experiences haven't been the same, um, excuse me, what we have done is we've both been able to acknowledge and accept, and then really work hard at overcoming where we were. And look at us now. I mean, you've written a couple of books. I've written a book. You've done a podcast for the last 3 years. We're doing this one together. I mean, we're not allowing all that negative, ugly stuff in our past to affect who we are today and the women we're going to be tomorrow.
Right. Your trauma might tell you where you've been, but it will never tell you where you're going.
Exactly. Exactly. And I think that's a really positive note to end up on today. What do you think?
I think so. I think that felt good. It felt like we accomplished something here.
I hope so. And I do hope our listeners have learned something positive today and feel that, they're not alone. There are so many of us out there that have experienced horrific things, and we've managed to turn it around for ourselves, and just like they can.
They can all grow from the darkness.
Yeah.
Tune in to the next episode when we start talking about the first of the trauma symptoms, denial. You can find out more about Growth from Darkness through the website www.growthfromdarkness.com. You can also learn more through the Facebook page, which can be found at facebook.com/growth from darkness. Thank you.